Hi there, everyone. This is Dan Bressler from the Autism Resource Center at Options and Advocacy for McHenry County. And today I want to do a little bit of a longer presentation about inclusive education, specifically why we should be focusing on inclusive education. So if you're a parent of a student with an IEP, this video is for you. If you're a teacher, whether you're a general education teacher or a special education teacher, this video is for you. If you're a special education administrator or a building administrator or principal, maybe, this video is for you. And if you're a related service provider, or speech therapist, social workers, occupational therapists, physical therapists, this video is for you as well, because if we're going to make inclusive education work, we need to have the whole team of people on board. And so today I really wanted to focus on the why of inclusive education, making a case for inclusive education. I'm going to talk a little bit about what inclusive education is, but I'm really not going to be talking about how we do inclusive education. That's a whole topic all by itself. There's a lot of information out there about that. Maybe we'll do a video on that at a different time, but I thought that the first step really was just to make sure that everyone's on board with just the idea that we should be trying to do inclusive education. So that's what we're going to focus on today. So let's get into it. So I wanted to start by talking about the types of education, and specifically the types of special education that we see across our community, across the state, across the country, and really across the world. And I drew this from a study that I'm going to be talking about later called A Summary of the Evidence on Inclusive Education that was done by a Harvard researcher and a private research firm. So this is sort of summarized from that article, and I'll have the link for that in the end. It's free for everybody to access. So one type of special education is segregation. That's basically where students with disabilities are educated in a completely different space than people without disabilities. So that could be a specialized classroom within a normal school building. So we see our autism programs or our emotional disability programs, things like that. That's one type of segregation. There's also therapeutic day schools, which is another type of segregation, where the students with disabilities are educated in a completely separate building than their same age peers without IEPs. So that's therapeutic day schools. Sometimes special education cooperatives will have separate buildings, but those are both the most common types of segregated education. Then we have integration, and that's where our students with disabilities and IEPs join into the regular education classroom, so they're in the same space. But the content and the teaching methods that are used in that space really aren't changed significantly. And what that means is that the student with the IEP, their participation in that space, their ability to be in that space and whether or not they're allowed to be in that space, really depends on their ability to adjust to the already existing requirements of that classroom. So we may hear things about a student, whether or not they can keep up in a general education third grade classroom, whether or not they have the same reading skills to be able to keep up with their peers. And if the answer is yes, then they can join that classroom. And that's a type of integration. And as we'll see in a minute, integration and inclusion are not the same thing. So inclusion, and I took a direct quote from the article because I thought it explained it really well. Inclusion involves changes and modifications in content, teaching methods, approaches, structures, and strategies in education to overcome barriers with a vision serving to provide all students of the relevant age range with an equitable and participatory learning experience and environment that best corresponds to their requirements and preferences. So whereas in integration, we're saying that if a student has the skills to keep up with their same age peers or to participate in the typical way in a general education classroom, then they can join. When we talk about inclusion, we're talking about how can we change that typical classroom to allow everybody to have a meaningful education and participatory experience in that space. So rather than making the student adjust to the environment, we're changing the environment to be inclusive of everybody. So what does that look like? This is adapted from an article by Paula Kluth on her website, which is www.paulakluth.com. And the article is called, Is Your School Inclusive? And I've got the URL here on the bottom of the screen. And all these URLs I'm including throughout the presentation, I'll also have in the description of the video when it's posted to YouTube. So you can access all of that. So all of this information is adapted from Paula Kluth. So the first thing is that in an inclusive space, an inclusive school, in an inclusive community, all students are viewed as capable and members of the same community. Okay, so everyone is a part of the same community. Democratic classrooms is one thing that Paula Kluth talks about a lot as being a marker of an inclusive school. And what she says that means is that all students and all staff members are treated with respect and dignity. All voices are honored and all contributions are seen as valuable. So you may see things like all students participating in the establishment and enforcement of what the classroom rules and expectations are. You might see teachers allowing students to have input into units and themes in the curriculum, things of that nature. And all students participate in that process and are seen as equal voices. Inclusive education environments are defined by a supportive school culture, and that starts at the very top from superintendents and principals and administrative staff, all the way to teachers and paraprofessionals and related service providers and the people on the ground doing the direct work. So it's an environment that's open, that's accepting, and that's caring. And that's when you listen to Paula Kluth talk about this, she describes that as being something that you know from the second that you step in the front door of a school building, whether it has that culture. It's sort of an intangible aspect of inclusive education. Inclusive educational environments are also defined by having engaging and relevant curriculum. That's engaging and relevant to the students. So it engages a range of learning styles, whether that's visual learners or active learners or auditory learners. We're including all of those people in how we're designing our curriculum. How are students going to learn? How are students going to demonstrate that they have learned? The curricula will be suitable for learners with various talents and interests. So we're talking about individualizing education, not just for individuals with disabilities, but those without disabilities as well. Taking their talents and interests into consideration as we design the curriculum so that they can have a really meaningful experience. The curriculum should also be relevant to students by making sure that the units are relevant, the themes are interesting, and the classroom materials are diverse to really bring everybody into the experience of learning. Paula Kluth goes on to say that inclusive education means having responsive instruction, which includes adapted materials, lesson structures, instructional arrangements, curricular goals and outcomes, and pay attention to that one in particular, and teaching techniques. So that means that students with IEPs or each individual student may have a different curricular goal in a particular learning experience. So while you're talking about a particular thing with the entire class, one student's goal may be to learn one aspect of that topic, while another student might be learning a different aspect of that topic, or weaving their other goals into that topic. So for example, if you're studying in science, you're studying how airplanes fly, one student's goal might be to be able to calculate how the lift works over the wing with air moving faster on top than underneath, and that creating lift, while another student's goal might be to write a short story about an airplane. So you can work on a bunch of different things in the exact same sort of unit or topic. And we're also changing our teaching techniques to work for all students. We're not asking students to figure out how to learn in the way that we teach. We're changing the way that we teach to ensure that each student is learning. It also means that 100% of the staff are there for 100% of the student. There's no my guys, your guys, their guys, those guys. Everyone is here for everyone. So that means regular education teachers are supporting students with IEPs. Special education teachers are supporting students without IEPs, because it turns out that the skills that special education teachers bring to the table in terms of differentiating instruction and designing unique curricula will help students without disabilities as well access learning in their own unique ways, because all learners are unique. And additionally, that means that we're going to be weaving our related service professionals, our social workers and our speech therapists and our occupational therapists into everyone's education, because they have a lot to give to all students. All students could use a little dose of social emotional learning. All students could benefit from learning about how to make sensory accommodations in their environments to enable them to learn better. Because those are things that we all do. Critically, inclusion means that students with disabilities are attending their local schools. They're attending their neighborhood schools, the schools that they're in the boundaries for anyway. And so this is really the extension of that idea. Students with disabilities are educated throughout the school building because, again, there's no such thing as an inclusion classroom or an inclusion program. In a truly inclusive building or district, the proportion of students with IEPs in any particular classroom will be the natural proportion of students with IEPs in the community, in the district as a whole. So we're seeing a natural spread of students with IEPs and without IEPs. And then finally, special educators, general educators, paraprofessionals, and related service professionals are going to be co-planning and co-teaching. That's an extension of that idea that 100% of the staff are there for 100% of the students. And it's a recognition that each staff member, each different type of staff member, as well as each individual staff member, brings different unique skills and perspectives to the table. And it's only with everyone's skills and perspectives that we're really going to be able to give students the best possible education. Okay, so that's sort of the what of inclusion so that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. And so the rest of this presentation is going to be dedicated to talking about why inclusion. Why should we be so focused on inclusion? Why is inclusion important? And I'm going to try to make 3 points to you today. The first is that inclusion is supported by special education law, and I would argue required by special education law. The second point is that inclusion benefits all students, that's students with IEPs and students without IEPs. And the third point that I want to make is a little bit of a larger point, a loftier point, and that's that inclusion in schools can lead to large-scale changes in local communities. So we're going to start by talking about the fact that inclusion is supported and I think required by special education law. So we're going to start with international law, okay? In 2006, there's a United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD. And the short version of this is that all of the signatories, including the United States, must ensure that persons with disabilities can access an inclusive, quality, and free primary education and secondary education on an equal basis with others in the communities in which they live. Persons with disabilities can access education on an equal basis with others in the communities in which they live. So this is a United Nations convention that essentially requires inclusive education. In the United States, in federal law, we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA or IDEA. And here's what it says about inclusion. To the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities are educated with children who are not disabled, and special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from the regular educational environment occurs only when the nature or severity of the disability of a child is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So there's a lot there. Let's break it down just a little bit. Essentially what it's saying is that when we're thinking about inclusion and whether or not a student should be in inclusion or segregation, the question should always be why not? Why can't they be in inclusion? Why won't this work? Rather than why. Inclusion is always the default in special education. Nobody should ever be asking another team member on an IEP team to argue why they think that inclusion will work in this case. The burden of proof is always on the person claiming that a student needs to be segregated or otherwise isolated from the regular education peers. And it also says that in making that claim and that argument that a student can't receive a free and appropriate public education in an inclusive environment, they have to demonstrate why that can't be done even with the support of supplementary aids and services. So what does supplementary aids and services mean? It can mean support from other professionals within the general education environment, whether that's a paraprofessional or related service providers and therapists, a special education teacher, and a co-taught environment. So when we consider whether or not a student needs to be removed from the general education environment, we have to say that they can't receive a free and appropriate public education, even if all of these strategies are tried, all of these supplementary aids and services. It also includes a modified curriculum and assignments. which means that students don't need to keep up with the general education curriculum. That's integration, and it's not inclusion. So each student may use learning opportunities to learn different things, or they may demonstrate their knowledge in a different way. Maybe somebody isn't going to demonstrate that they know about airplanes again, how airplanes work, by taking a written test about it. Maybe they'll verbally describe or verbally answer those questions to demonstrate their knowledge. Or maybe they'll do some sort of hands-on project. Maybe they'll build a model of an airplane that demonstrates how wings create lift, things of that nature. Everyone will demonstrate their knowledge in a different way. Supplementary aids and services can also include assistive tech, whether that's speech to text, whether that's a speech generating device, an AAC device. And supplementary aids and services also include training for school personnel. That means training general education staff on strategies for successful inclusion. It means possibly sending our pairs of teachers to trainings to learn about how co-teaching works successfully. It may mean additional training for our paraprofessional about how to provide support in an inclusive environment. There's all kinds of different options in terms of what that training for school personnel can mean. And so what this means is that only if we can demonstrate reasonably that a student will still not be able to receive a free and appropriate public education if we provide all of these different types of supplementary aids and services, and this isn't an exhaustive list, this is just a few ideas, only then can we say that it's time to exclude them in a self-contained classroom, or it's time to send them to a therapeutic day school. And that's supported by, again, by IDEA, by federal law. So let's look a little bit at case law. When this law has been sort of challenged in court, what have the courts decided? So this is a case, Oberti versus the Board of Education in 1993. It was in the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. And basically what had happened is that the district hadn't provided the student with these supplementary aids and supports and services that he needed to be successful in an inclusive environment, and failed to provide the school staff with adequate training. So they hadn't done all of this, and then they had segregated the student in, I think, a self-contained classroom. And here's what the judge said. The judge said that the burden of proof is on the district, not the family. The school has to prove why inclusion won't work if done appropriately with all of those supports and services that are options on the table. And the family doesn't have to prove why inclusion will work. The judge said that inclusion is a right and not a special privilege for a select few. So this case really supported this idea that only if districts can demonstrate that all of these ideas won't work, whether or not, honestly, it's something that's already provided in the district or not, the district is required to exhaust all of those opportunities before moving a student into a segregated environment. Here's one more case, Roncker versus Walter in 1983, and here's what the judge wrote in his decision. It's not enough for a district to simply claim that a segregated program is superior. In a case where the segregated facility is considered superior, the court should determine whether the services which make the placement superior could be feasibly provided in the non-segregated setting, such as the regular education class. If they can, the placement in the segregated school would be inappropriate under the Act. And he was talking about IDEA. Okay. And so when he's talking about segregated facility, segregated school, this can also be applied to segregated programs such as a self-contained classroom. And so what he's saying is that if we're saying that this segregated program or facility is superior for a student, that we feel that this is the best placement for a student, then the next step in making a placement decision is saying, well, what are the aspects of that program that make it superior? Is it that all of the staff have training in behavioral techniques? Is it that there's a 1-to-1 ratio? Is it that the teachers modify the curriculum? And then we have to ask, why can't those aspects of the program that we think is superior be provided within the regular education environment? Why can't we have a 1-to-1 para in the regular education environment? Why can't the staff in the regular education environment be trained in basic behavioral principles? And if Those things can be feasibly done in the regular education environment, and obviously the word feasibly is up for interpretation. But if it can be feasibly done within the general education environment, then it would be inappropriate to segregate that student in a separate facility or self-contained classroom. Okay, so that's a sort of a crash course, a brief overview of the support for inclusion in special education legislation, law, and case law. But honestly, I even though I do feel that inclusion is required by law in almost all cases, I think that the better argument, rather than leaning into the law, is to lean into the research on inclusion. And the research really does say that inclusion benefits all learners in an educational environment. So that's what we're going to talk about next. Okay, so this is the study that I was talking about earlier, a summary of the evidence on inclusive education. I've got a link here. I'll also have that in the description of the video. The authors were, it was led by a professor in the Harvard Graduate School of Education, as well as a researcher at SRI Education. And it was in 2016, so it's relatively recent. And what they did is they compiled all of the high quality research that they could find on inclusive education, and they summarized it in this document. And again, this is available to anybody free online, and the link will be in the description. So let's start by looking at what they found in terms of the impact on students with disabilities in inclusive environments. What they say is that students with disabilities who were educated in general education classes academically outperformed their peers who had been educated in segregated settings. So students with disabilities academically outperformed those in segregated settings. They performed better on language and math assessments. They performed better in measures of reading comprehension. They had better school attendance. They were more likely to graduate on time than their peers in segregated settings. They were nearly twice as likely to attend post-secondary education, university or vocational training. They were more likely to be employed and earn more than non-included peers. And so that sort of is a really quick rundown of what they found academically, that the students in inclusive settings outperformed their peers in segregated settings, pretty much across the board. They also said that inclusion can support the social and emotional development of students with disabilities. They found that students with disabilities in inclusive settings had higher levels of engaged behavior. They were more accepted by peers and less lonely. They were more likely to belong to school groups and clubs, extracurricular activities. Interestingly, they had fewer behavioral challenges. That's a really common concern about including students with disabilities in regular education environments as well. How are we going to handle their behaviors, their behavioral challenges? Well, this study found that actually when we include students, they have fewer behavioral challenges, which obviously results in fewer disciplinary actions and behavioral referrals. They also found that students in inclusive environments, were more independent and more self-sufficient. So that's students with disabilities. Across the board, academically and socially, these researchers concluded that students with disabilities benefit more from inclusive education than segregated education. But what about the impact of students without disabilities when they had students with disabilities in the classroom with them? That's a very common concern that we hear about inclusion as well. Is this going to hold back the people in the classroom without disabilities, or what impact will that have on their learning? And it's a good question. So what these researchers found was that non-disabled students can benefit academically from inclusion. And the results weren't as stark for students without disabilities as they were for students with disabilities in terms of the degree of benefit. But what they found was that typically inclusion has a positive or neutral academic impact on students without disabilities. And again, because we know that legally the question in terms of inclusion should always be why not rather than why, we really don't need to see that students without disabilities will benefit from the inclusion of students with disabilities. What we need to see is that they won't be harmed by it. And they found that in almost all cases, it's a positive or neutral academic impact. And what they said is that in all studies across the board, the differences between schools were much larger than the differences between inclusive and non-inclusive classrooms within those schools. And what they said is that this means that the overall quality of instruction in a school plays a bigger role in shaping the achievement of non-disabled students than whether or not a student was educated alongside children with disabilities. So what they're saying is that in cases maybe where students without disabilities weren't benefited academically, or maybe they saw academic harm, the difference wasn't whether or not a student with a disability was included in their classroom. It was an overall question of the quality of the education. And we have a power to shape that in our school buildings. Here's something else that they said. They said that in effective inclusive schools, the traditional isolated classroom is replaced with a more flexible structure that facilitates collaboration across school staff. This permits educators to develop coordinated approaches focused on addressing the specific needs of individual students. The skills these educators develop to support students with disabilities help them to better address the unique needs of all of their students. And this is something that we talk about a lot. It turns out that a lot of the strategies that we talk about for supporting students with autism or students with disabilities in general actually benefits all learners. When we become more flexible teachers, more flexible thinkers, we end up providing a higher quality education to all students because we're taking into account everybody's unique strengths, needs, and interests. And that's a really important factor in providing a high quality education. So here's basically the take-home message from this study in 2016. After considering all of the evidence, they said, there is clear and consistent evidence that inclusive educational settings can confer substantial short and long-term benefits for students with and without disabilities. Inclusion benefits all learners. And so that's really the second point that I want to make in making this case for inclusion, is that inclusion benefits all learners. And that's one of the big reasons that we should be focusing on moving in this direction in all of our school buildings and in all of our districts. Hey everyone, it's Dan. I want to take a quick time out here as I'm in the editing process, because between the time that I recorded this video and when I started to edit it and get it ready to post it, I came across a podcast that had a really great story that I wanted to include. So the next clip is going to come from the Inclusion podcast, which is from Dr. Julie Causton. She's a former professor in special education from Syracuse University and now runs a company called Inclusive Schooling and does consulting and speaking work. So unfortunately, this is just an audio clip with no video, but I'm going to try to find a nice picture for you to look at while you listen to the story. If you don't want to listen to the story, feel free to skip ahead to where my presentation picks back up in a few minutes here. But I just thought it was a nice story to include that sort of illustrates some of the points that we're talking about in terms of inclusive education benefiting all learners. So here you go.
I'm going to read for you an article that Kate MacLeod and I wrote with Nelia, who is Sabrina's mother. So we're going to tell you a little story about Sabrina. Sabrina is a very popular second grader. Her classmates love spending time with her, both in and out of school. Kids line up to read to Sabrina during story time, crowd to help her with math flashcards or classroom chores, and are eager to have their parents set up weekend play dates. In fact, at Sabrina's latest play date, none of the children wanted to leave her when their parents came to take them home. But 2 years ago, if you had asked her mom, Nelia, whether Sabrina was a popular kid, you likely would have gotten an anxious look, a shake of the head, or maybe a few tears. So what changed? Sabrina? Did her peers? Did she acquire a new backyard water slide? No, no, and no. What changed was her educational placement. When Sabrina entered school, her well-meaning teachers saw a lovely young girl with significant disability. They saw her communication challenges and her academic and social delays and decided her significant needs would be best served in a special education class separated from her peers without disabilities. She would have a small class size, she wouldn't be bullied, and she wouldn't be distracted. She would be able to learn and grow and make new friends with students like her. Sabrina entered this separate special education classroom and remained there for several years. And while her teacher was kind and loving, Sabrina had limited access to general education curriculum, and neither Sabrina nor her family felt part of the school. Worst of all, because other children in Sabrina's class also had limited verbal and social skills, she did not make much progress or any meaningful relationships. After 3 years of sleepless nights and countless tears of frustration and worry, Nelia, Sabrina's mom, asked the school for a new placement for Sabrina in the general education classroom. Nelia explained she wanted Sabrina to have the same opportunities students without disabilities had: access to general education curriculum and access to friendships. The school team was shocked. They tried to convince Nelia that she was making a mistake, that it wasn't possible for a student with such significant needs to be included in general education. When Nelia pressed them, why wasn't this possible, they responded that Sabrina was 2 below grade level. Her sensory challenges would cause her to shut down. She would disrupt other children, and the students would bully her for her differences. Worst of all, they worried, Sabrina would be even more isolated and alone. But Nelia still believed inclusion would work, so she advocated for Sabrina to be included. She hired an attorney to help her prove that under IDEA, all students with disabilities have the right to be included with appropriate supports and services in the general education classroom. Nelia's period of advocacy coincided with the new special education administration in the district that was more supportive of inclusion. After 6 months of countless meetings and even a trial run, Sabrina finally received an official placement in the general education classroom. Unsurprisingly to us, including Sabrina has been exceptionally successful. Her teachers gush about her academic and social growth, reporting that Sabrina is focusing during interaction, meeting her academic goals, becoming more independent, and making many friends. But including Sabrina isn't just good for Sabrina, it's good for everyone. While many of Sabrina's peers enjoy working with her, she is particularly close with 2 boys, Tim and Talon. In the beginning of the year, Tim could barely read, but because he knew Sabrina loved listening to stories, he began reading to her simple picture books. While Sabrina listened and took in new information, Tim's reading fluency and confidence grew. His attitude towards reading has greatly shifted, and now he is reading Sabrina chapter books while she sits and listens intently. Talon, on the other hand, struggles with focus and attention. But when he works with Sabrina, he is patient, calm, and loving. In fact, Talon's mother recently wrote, "What I have come to realize is that having Sabrina in class has helped Talon in more ways than I could have imagined. It has taught him so much, and he truly loves her." The 3 children often sit together and read together. The first time Sabrina's teacher saw their shared reading time, she was compelled to write Nelia about the moment. "When I saw these 3 in the classroom together, I burst out in a huge smile. I know one thing for sure, it is no accident that their paths crossed. The question about inclusion is easily answered during moments like that." Sabrina's teacher and school team have all benefited from inclusion. Their initial questions about whether Sabrina and other students with significant disabilities could succeed in general education have been answered with a resounding yes. For them, inclusion is no longer a fear, but an opportunity for immense academic and social growth. Her teacher, Nancy, explains, "Our expectations are growing and changing as Sabrina progresses. Expectations for Sabrina will always continue to grow, and she is meeting them." Sabrina's school district has also taken note of her success. They now recognize the need to support inclusion with greater intensity. Next year, the district will concentrate heavily on inclusive program development in 2 more of their schools, focusing on the best practices for including students with disabilities in the general education classroom. They plan on taking inclusive program development to more and more of their schools and eventually create a much more inclusive school district. So now, whenever Nelia speaks with other parents or educators who are struggling with the concept of inclusion, wondering if it really improves the lives of everyone, she has a very simple answer. Of course it does. Just ask Sabrina or her friends.
Okay, so finally, 3rd point, last point. Inclusion in schools can lead to large-scale changes in local communities. And again, this is a bit of a loftier point. There is some evidence behind what I'm saying, though. I'm not just opining. So in order to understand how this happens, we need to understand contact theory. And that's a theory by a psychologist named Allport in 1954. And what he said is that biases and stereotypical associations decrease with exposure under the right circumstances. So when there are particular groups of people that we may hold biases toward or stereotypical associations or discriminatory views toward, when we gain exposure to those populations under particular conditions, our biases and negative associations decrease. And so those conditions are equal status in the environment in the exposure environment, common goals, a cooperative attitude, cooperation, as well as some social norms established by authority. There need to be some ground rules for this exposure and for this interaction. And so what we find is that when inclusion is done well and done correctly, it absolutely meets these conditions for contact theory. Okay, so when we are in an inclusive classroom, it's a democratic classroom, which means that all students have equal status. They're involved in the goal making, and the goal is ultimately learning. Education should be cooperative and not competitive. And so those conditions are met in an inclusive class, a high quality inclusive classroom. And in fact, we will establish social norms that are established and enforced by the authority figure, the teacher and the school staff. All of our schools have school rules. Hopefully the students will be involved in the creation of those rules so they have some buy-in and some investment in those rules. But those rules will be established and enforced by the authority figure in the classroom. And so in inclusive settings, we do meet the conditions for contact theory to sort of be in effect. So what does this mean? This means that this research on contact theory does support the application of contact theory to inclusive education. So here's what the research says. And again, this is from that same article, a summary of the evidence on inclusive education. The authors say that inclusion can support the social and emotional development of non-disabled students. So they're talking about the students without IEPs. Here's what they found. They cited a 1995 study which found that there were 5 big benefits of inclusion for non-disabled students. And those benefits were reduced fear of human differences. When we're in a classroom that values diversity and values human differences, we become less afraid and less suspicious of those differences. We see a growth of social cognition in students without disabilities when they have students with disabilities included in their learning environment. We see improvements in the self-concept of the students without disabilities. We see the development of personal, moral, and ethical principles. Students without disabilities who are educated in inclusive environments become more moral and ethical thinkers. And finally, we find that students without disabilities who are educated with students with disabilities develop warm and caring friendships, both with the other students without disabilities and with students with disabilities. So we see more friendships with students with disabilities, which means, by extension, that there's less observed bullying of students with disabilities, and that's demonstrated in the research as well. And the authors of this summary sort of posited that may be because students in inclusive schools were more likely to stand up for their peers with disabilities. When we're all educated together, we develop friendships with people who are different than us, which means that we are more willing to go to bat for our friends. So we see less bullying of students with disabilities. And all of this can lead to community change because as districts commit to inclusion over the long term, this is a long-term project, children grow up to be adults and adults in that community. And the social emotional impacts that we see in the schools that we talked about back here, less bullying, improvements in self-concept, warm and caring friendships, moral and ethical thinking. When those students grow up to be adults in the community, that will increasingly become the norm in that community. As we graduate more classes from our high schools who have been educated in this setting and who have experienced these changes in moral and ethical thinking and friendships and experiencing care for people with disabilities, that will gradually become the norm, the majority viewpoint in a community. And that means that our communities can become less prejudiced. It means that they can be appreciative of diversity rather than afraid. And it means that it can be less isolating for people with disabilities because if everybody's educated in an inclusive environment, if everybody grows up with people with disabilities in their classrooms, learning with them, learning from them sometimes, developing friendships with them, that will be the norm. And so the idea that we would then isolate those people in isolated residential communities and things of that nature won't really make sense anymore. Because we've been with them our whole lives. Why would we start isolating them now? So the entire community can become more inclusive of people with disabilities. And that's a valuable goal to work toward, I would say. So that's a pretty brief picture of why I would argue that inclusion in schools can lead to large-scale changes in local communities. So that's basically what I have to say about why we should be striving for inclusion, why we should be focused on this, why this should be a conversation at every single IEP meeting that we have. So here are some resources on inclusion. I'm aware that in the video you won't be able to click these links, so I'm going to put them down in the description below. The top one is a link to the report that I cited throughout the presentation. University of Minnesota page that talks about 10 of their ideas of reasons that we should be doing inclusion. Paula Kluth's website. I would also recommend checking out Julie Causton. She's at inclusiveschooling.com. She's another leader in inclusive schooling. She's a professor at Syracuse University, I believe. And then the bottom link, even UNICEF says that inclusive education should be our standard, and so there's that resource as well. So if you have any thoughts about inclusive education or this presentation, if you have any questions, if you have any requests for future topics, shoot me an email or give me a call. My contact information is here. We're monitoring our voicemail and our email even during this pandemic. As of the recording of this, we're still all self-quarantining in our homes for the most part. So, but we're still available to parents, to school providers, to paraprofessionals, and to really anybody in the community who has questions and thoughts about how to include people with autism in our community, in our classrooms, in our schools. So I appreciate you taking the time to stick with me here. This was a bit of a longer presentation, but I think it's really, really important. And I hope that's something that everybody really considers and thinks about as we head into the summer, head into our next school year, and head into the future. I think we should all be considering inclusive education a little bit more carefully. So thank you very much and have a great day.